Rick Lay is here to do our next presentation. He's going to do the history of Longenberger baskets. Oh, wrong convention. No, history of the Avenger. Welcome, Rick.
Originally, I wasn't supposed to do this presentation. This is going to be a little nervy, but for whatever reason, we're going to make it. The research was valuable. But this is I am sort of the reluctant presenter. As we'll see as we go through the history of the Avenger, I became the reluctant chronologist for it. Officially, totally out of the blue. Now, the Avenger grew as a combination of two Pulp heroes, Doc Savage and the Shadow. Street Smith decided to combine the two characters, or concepts, characteristics of the two heroes into a new character called the Avenger. That decision happened around either late 1938 or early 1939. The man who dreamed it up was Henry W. Alston, who at that time was the vice president at Street Smith. He had been the business manager in the early 30s when the characters were first conceived. Now, they had then a conference of 3 writers. The man on the right is Lester Dent, who, as Kenneth Robeson was writing Doc Savage primarily, there were other writers who were involved with Doc Savage. He was the original writer and the primary author of the series. The gentleman on the left is Walter Gibson, who, of course, was the author of the Shadow novels. And in the middle you see Paul Ernst, who had done work as a horror writer for Weird Tales, and had also written some detective stories. And he came up as the character of the Avenger, fleshed him out. And for those of you who don't know the Avenger, I'm just going to briefly summarize what the character is, and then we're going to trace all the influences on him. The Avenger is a man named Richard Henry Benson. Now, he is in his 30s when the novels begin. He is married with a young daughter. He had lived an incredibly adventurous life and had traveled all over the world. Somehow, he has abilities akin to Doc Savage, but we never learn how. He is the greatest Renaissance man since Leonardo da Vinci, or Clark Savage Jr. And he decides to take an airplane flight because his wife's mother, I think she's extremely ill. That was the explanation. And she lived in Canada, he was in the United States. And on the flight, he decides to go to the bathroom. It's to wash his hands, because you couldn't say why people went to the bathroom for the real reasons in those days. And when he comes out, his wife and daughter have disappeared, and everybody claims they were never on the plane. Now, we later discover they've been murdered. But this whole shock of this happening to him causes his hair to turn white and his facial muscles to be paralyzed. And this flies in the face of science, but supposedly if your facial muscles become paralyzed, you are suddenly like Plastic Man and can shape your face into anything possible. So he now has the ability to become a super master of disguise. And he then uses his vast, he sets himself up in a publicly as a crime fighter in an organization called Justice Incorporated. Now, Ernst's background in detective fiction influences characteristics of the Avenger. There was an excellent collection by Altus Press called CK and Other Prototypes of the Avenger by Paul Ernst. There's an excellent introduction by Will Murray. And it mentions several characters. We'll later allude to some of them elsewhere in the presentation. But the one we're going to concentrate right now is a character called the Wraith. And the Wraith was created in 1936 for detective tales. And he was a one-shot character, even though he had this incredible potential to go on for this whole series of adventures. And the Wraith is a man named Perry Westbrook, who was in a train accident. And his face gets messed up. And he has the same face that Two-Face has in the Batman comics. Half of it's very bad, and half of it's mean and ugly and twisted downward. But he also gets this facial paralysis that the Avenger or Benson would get. And he discovers that he can mold his face. So what he decides to do is he's going to make the happy, both sides match the happy, pleasant face when he's Perry Westbrook, and when he's the Wraith, he'll make it mean and ugly. Now the other things that pop up, the Avenger will have two special weapons. They'll have a gun named Mike, which is a .22 caliber pistol with a very thin barrel, and which he would shoot and knock out guys by creasing their skulls. And he also has a knife called Ike, and he would strap these to his ankles. You can see the forerunner of both weapons in the Wraith. The Wraith has a pipe-like gun that he straps to his knee. And he doesn't care about not taking life. He'll kill folks in any way he wants. And it's button operated, so it's under his pants. So if he's sitting like this toward the crook and taps his knee, he's just shot him in the heart. And then he just had a simple throwing knife. Now, one of the other sort of famous character that Ernst created, just to get his full credentials out of the way, but he was writing for Weird Tales. He got drafted to write a character that the editor Barnes Wright was very enthusiastic about, but it really didn't catch on. Called Dr. Satan, who was an incredible master criminal who used black magic to commit crimes. He really doesn't influence the Avenger, but you see some of the villains, like in the Black Death and novels like the Black Death and the Blood Ring, where they pretend to do supernatural crimes. They're sort of like the descendants of Dr. Satan, except they're phony magicians. Now, the name Richard Henry Benson was largely inspired by Henry W. Ralston, and it comes from Richard Henry Savage, who was an engineer, an author, something of an explorer, who lived in the late 19th century, died in 1903 in a rather tragic traffic accident. A horseless carriage ran him down where he was crossing the street. And Ralston had known him, and the name Doc Savage came from the Savage part. So the Richard Henry came from the first part of his name. Now, this decision to combine elements of Avenger, of Doc Savage and the Shadow, had actually been done before by a competitor. And that was the character, that was Secret Agent X was the character who was created, who was published between 1934 and 1939. And as we will see, the Avenger is basically Doc Savage. It's even published under the name Kenneth Robeson, which was Lester Dent's alias, with some elements of the Shadow. And they don't use as much of the Shadow as they thought they should, or maybe they could have. And that reason, I think, happened because of Secret Agent X. Secret Agent X was a copy of the Shadow with a lot of little characteristics of Doc Savage. Secret Agent X operated as a vigilante. Like the Shadow, was a World War I spy. Like the Shadow, was a master of disguise, master of makeup. He's got agents positioned in different parts of society. He's got established cover identities. That's the Shadow part. The Avenger part is, let's throw in a commitment not to take you with life. Let's throw in non-lethal weaponry, sleep gas devices and things. So you then have a combination of the two Street Smith heroes, but the emphasis is more on the Shadow. So if you're going to do that again, you got to go the other way. Now, when I was looking at this, I was looking at the timing of these decisions to create the Avenger. The Avenger, Paul Ernst submits the first manuscript, ironically, in February 1939, which is when the last issue of Secret Agent X, dated March 1939, hits the newsstand, which is an intriguing irony. And I don't know, I was wondering, had Ralston heard that this magazine was dying out? And maybe, our competitors have successfully combined the two characters. Let's do it now. And now that they no longer have a combination character, let's make one of our own. Certainly, Secret Agent X influenced it, whether they knew he was being terminated, and that affected the creation of the Avenger. I have no idea. Now, the concept of the rubber face actually originated in 1910 in a popular detective called Cleek of the 40 Faces, who was created by Thomas Hanshaw. And Cleek was a Scotland Yard, or Cleek, let me correct it. Cleek was a burglar in London, England, sort of a Raffles type, who decides to reform and join Scotland Yard. Now he has this incredible rubber-like face that he was born with. By today's standards, he would be a superhero mutant. Now, the explanation for how he gets this ability makes no sense. We didn't have radiation, or at least, actually we probably did have radiation. Madame Curie was experimenting. They weren't smart enough to, Thomas Hanshaw wasn't smart enough to come up with radiation as the explanation. He just said Cleek's mother was playing around with a rubber doll when she was pregnant. So somehow you get human children who can twist their faces and anything possible. Now, you may say, wonder, what does Leslie Charteris' The Saint have to do as the Avenger? Now, if you're my age, I was born in 1955, you know The Saint from Roger Moore in the 60s, and he travels around the world, and he's a cosmopolitan adventurer. But the Saint goes back to, the Saint went through different phases. What you saw, if you saw the Roger Moore TV series, you saw the post-World War II version of the Saint. The pre-World War I version is very different. The Saint was created in 1928 by Leslie Charteris. And the original version was more like the Spider. He was Saint was a vigilante who killed crooks. Instead of marking him as a red spider, he left a little sheet of paper as a stick figure in a halo, or wrote it on the wall or something. And he had his favorite weapon, which we never saw on the TV show, were two throwing knives called Anna and Belle that he strapped to his wrists. Though there were occasions where he wore them on his ankle. Now, even though we saw the Avengers weaponry foreshadowed in Ernst's own detective, The Raid, the knife idea and having these hidden sheaths or holsters may have come from the Saint. Now, the concept of vengeance was important in creating the Avenger, and nearly every Pulp hero somehow dates back to Alexander Dumas' The Count of Monte Cristo, a man who creates a new identity after he's unjustly imprisoned. But Walter Gibson, when he was asked how much did he influence the Avenger, he said, originally I didn't think that there was too much of the shadow in the Avenger, but Gibson then said, I wrote this novel called Vengeance is Mine, which was published in 1937, which is about a man who has who's victimized by criminals and decides to get back. But unlike the Avenger, he doesn't draw the line at taking human life. Eventually he becomes as bad as a criminal himself, and the shadow has to take him out. And Gibson believes that that influenced Ralston. Now, Ernst had created another character which was in the Seed Cake collection that I mentioned earlier. It was another one-shot character who could have had a whole series of his own, called Old Stoneface. He was in a story called I Am Their Execution. And Old Stoneface was written around, I think, 37. Old Stoneface is an FBI agent whose wife gets killed and he becomes very vicious and addicted towards criminals. But since he's an FBI agent, he can kill them pretty much and not get any trouble. So then we have all the ingredients for Justice Incorporated. And here we have both the cover by H. Winfield Scott and my favorite interior illustration. Now, one thing about the Avenger, the way he dressed in Pulps, he just wore gray suits. So he would wear a gray shirt, a gray tie, a gray jacket, maybe a gray vest, gray pants. As we're going to later see, we have a different, currently artistic conception of the gray aspect of the Avenger is foreshadowed by another character that Ernst had created around 37, called Tom Dixon, who was in a story called A Case for the Great Marauder, but I was at least browsing through it, and I don't think he's ever called the Great Marauder in the story. But he has another identity where he fights crime, and he always dresses in gray. In the first novel, the Avenger picks up two ways. Fergus McMurdy, who's a pharmacist and chemist, whose wife and child were killed by criminals, so his history somewhat mimics that. And then we have Smitty, who is a brilliant engineer. His full name is Algernon Heathcott Smith. And besides being a brilliant technician, he is huge physically, and would beat the heck out of like 3 different guys at once. Now, he has a little interesting history because he really wasn't supposed to be Caucasian. The original Smitty was based on the character you see on the right, who's Jericho Troop, who was in the shadow and was primarily the brawn of the Shadow's agents. But if you read this novel carefully, he was actually a pretty smart guy who could go under, one of a very difficult undercover mission in the Shadow, but that seemed to get lost in the novels. So it looked like Smitty, and we see this in the interior art of the early Avenger novels, was originally supposed to be black. And for some reasons that are unknown, at the last minute they said we're not going to go that way. Maybe they thought it was too similar to Jericho. Now in the second novel, The Yellow Horde, the Avenger gets, even though he's wealthy and he's made money several times over, crime fighting is expensive, so in order to fund all these operations that he's doing, they happen to discover a hidden cache of Aztec gold in Mexico. That idea may have come from H. Rider Haggard's 1893 novel, Monarchs in the Border. It was about an Englishman during the conquest who goes to Mexico to learn the conquest by Cortez, and actually sees the Aztecs hide their gold in a hidden underground tomb. And you could speculate, if you're like many of the Watt Newman's people, such as myself, that what you're actually seeing is what the Avenger found in that novel. Now, Haggard, the whole concept of gold and hidden gold by Indian tribes goes back to Doc Savage. We had the Mayan civilization, but the Mayan civilization also dates back to H. Rider Haggard. He wrote a novel called The Heart of the World in 1895, which had a city of gold in Guatemala, which was one of the influences on the fictional country of Hidalgo with Doc Savage. Now, ironically, you've seen that Smitty was originally supposed to be African American, and he becomes Caucasian. In a strange way, in The Yellow Horde, when we get the Avenger's female aide, Nellie Gray, she was originally African American. That's little known. But that's because of where the name was derived from. Nellie Gray was a popular song that was written in 1856 by a man named B.H. Handy, and it's sung by a slave in the United States whose wife, Nellie Gray, has been taken away from him and sold to another slave. So that's where they got the Nellie Gray. So after having two characters who, at least in some way, were originally supposed to be African American, Paul Ernst finally gets apparently permission to do a true African American group of characters, who are both a man and a woman. And that's Roosevelt and Josh Newton, who appear in the third novel. And two of the most innovative characters for the time in the Pulps. They are graduates of Tuskegee University. And their role for the Avenger will be that they will often get jobs as servants in Caucasian households. And they would act the way whites expect black people to act, which unfortunately at the time was to be superstitious and not too bright. So this could be an intriguing commentary on racial affairs, but there's a little problem with it. The novel which they appeared in was the Skywalker, which they joined because their employer got murdered. The next novel is The Devil's Horn, and Devil's Horns. And in that novel, they meet a black servant who is the racial stereotype. So it looked like early on, Street Smith was sort of having it both ways. They were defying racial stereotypes, but catering to them at the same time. But after The Devil's Horns, that never happened again. So the presentation of the news was exemplary. African Americans overall. Now, the Avenger apparently wasn't selling as well as Street Smith liked. So they decided to do two radical things in the Avenger. Around the 10th issue or so. And the first thing was the Avenger was going to get cured. He gets trapped in some chamber in an automobile factory and gets exposed to some weird sort of radiation. And his white hair becomes black again, brings up his facial muscles get restored. Now the photo on the left, or the interior drawing on the left, is not Richard W. Benson, that's Cole Wilson, who's the man who cures the Avenger, now becomes one of his assistants. Cole Wilson was sort of a young, energetic, heroic type, who was almost a rival to the Avenger. And that will later affect the paperback presentation of the Avenger, as you can see. Now, the Avenger then, of course, is presented differently in Pulp covers. He now has dark hair, starting with 3 gold crowns. But there was a little problem in this caused by this decision to change the Avenger. What frequently happened to Street and Smith, when they want to do something radically different, they juggle the novels. They say, let's push it up a little bit to increase sales. So there were 3 novels lurking in the archives when the Avenger still had white hair and most facial muscles. So what they had to do was re-edit the novels and give him black hair, and just have him use makeup to disguise himself. And Cole Wilson gets like a little explanation that he's offered Detroit referring to the government or something. So there's an explanation why he's a similar thing happened to Doc Savage when he introduced him to the chemistry. So he said we learned later, well, he was in quarantine for all those months again. The novels, the 3 novels on the earlier slide, House of Death, Death Low, and Death in Slow Motion. Those were the ones that were all editorial. Now, the Avenger lasted for about 24 issues and ended in 1942. Some say it's been the sales weren't as good as Street and Smith. There was also talk that the paper shortage made it. But they still try to play around with the character by having it appear in Clues magazine. But this time, Kenneth Rosen became Emil's temperament. Paul Lutz was out of the picture. Emil's temperament was had written Secret Agent X, done some spiders, did a series about Suicide Squad, and was known for pretty violent pulp novels. And When he started with the short stories, he tried to remain at least faithful to the original concept of the Avenger as being a guy who used sleep gas or whatever to knock out criminals. The first two stories that he wrote, Death of the Avenger and The Coffin of the Avenger, this are consistent at least with the original Ernst novels for that. You may think it's stylistically inferior. I kind of like The Coffin. That's sort of the minority. But then he radically shifting after his third story, Vengeance on the Avenger. And I show here the cover for when it was printed in Robert Weinberg's fancy Pulp. That's a Frank Hamilton book. And in Vengeance on the Avenger, suddenly we see the Avenger killing people. And this isn't explicitly explained, but if you read it, you can kind of have a hidden explanation. Well, the story is about a man who Richard Henry Benson knew in South Africa years ago, had a chance to kill, didn't kill, and now he's coming back to vengeance and the captain of the Avenger's existence. It was really caused Benson to become upset. So it's sort of like he regrets not killing the guy, so he decides now he's going to kill criminals from now on. And that was reflected in the latest stories, but it looked like Tepperman was polishing off short stories that got rejected or the magazine folded before they were printed, and would rewrite them as adventure stories. Because one of the stories is called Cargo of Doom, which has the Avenger battling Nazi spies before Pearl Harbor. And the second Avenger story, The Coffin for the Avenger, had the Avenger battling Nazi spies after Pearl Harbor. So you have this anomaly of one story where he's not killing people after Pearl Harbor, and a story where he is killing people before Pearl Harbor. So if you ever wanted to reconcile this, you got to say that he eventually, sometime after Pearl Harbor, decided he's going to go back to not killing people. Now, the Templeman shorts lasted for a few while. There were about 6 of them. The character of essentially manager Pulp. But he would get revived in paperback in 1970s. And what was most important about is that Warner paperback library. And the reprints of the novels, what is important is the artistic representation. He now gets a uniform. Looks sort of like a chauffeur's uniform. A little like Cato in the Green Hornet. But that has become the standard artistic depiction of the Avenger. When they ran out of, when they published the first 24 novels, they decided not to reprint the shorts in the paperbacks. And they hired a new writer, Ron Huar, to write new adventures. And he wrote 12. Starting with The Man from Atlantis. And his Avenger novels aren't really true to the spirit of the Pulps. They kind of read like TV shows from the 60s and 70s. They're fact, if you took it was like if you took the Man from U.N.C.L.E., they just incorporated U.N.C.L.E., they thrust Nazi spies, you would have pretty much your typical adventure novel by Ron Jubilee. So you see a lot of things from TV. But he did introduce some interesting little in-jokes and innovations. For instance, one of the novels is called The Purple Zombie, which is set in Hollywood. But besides having a cameo by Lamont Cranston, whether this is the real Lamont Cranston or the shadow impersonating Lamont Cranston is never explained. And also having a crazed science fiction band named F.J. Ackleroy, who's Forrest J. Ackerman under another name. The Purple Zombie is a movie that is being made by the studio, and it's derived from a comic strip done by Tark Mills, the creator of Miss Fury, the Purple Zombie, even though they never allude to that. I didn't find this out until many years later. I just thought they called it the Purple Zombie because that was a cool name. But another thing that Goulart did that was kind of funny was he was going to the predecessor to PulpFest, PulpCon, and meeting all these pulp collectors. So we decided to include characters with the names of noted pulp collectors or authorities in the stories. So Bob Weinberg, who is an author in his own rights, ends up as the chief of police in a novel called Red Moon. In a novel called Black Chariots, Nick Carr, who is probably the greatest expert on Operator 5 and G8, ends up lending a car to somebody who gets killed by a flying saucer. And perhaps the most shocking revelation of all involved Don Hutchinson in The Iron Skull. If we believe this novel, Don was a Nazi spy in 1944. Maybe he was really undercover since he's still around. Working for Allied intelligence, that's my theory. But the Iron Skull was Goulart's attempt to create a nemesis, a recurring enemy for the Avengers. We hadn't had any villains who really came back. Temperament and some of his shorts had some bad guy who would pop up and say that the Avenger fought before, but that was like the only time you were seeing him in the story. And the Iron Skull was sort of a cyborg villain. The novel involving him was published in 1975. It's 2 years after the $6 Million Man appeared on television. And he's a little like the $6 Million Man, and then he has a robotic arm, and it's more robotic than bionic. If you remember how the $6 Million Man is set up in their legs. So he has this part metal and part flesh. Part of his face is metal. And even though the $6 Million Man may have been the logical inspiration for this, there's another character from television whose origins actually go back to the Pulps, who sort of was the forerunner of the Iron Skull. Now, there was a writer named Steve Fisher who created many pulp heroes, created some aviation pulp heroes. He also created a character named Sheridan Doom, who was the backup feature for The Shadow in the 1930s. And Sheridan Doom was a naval officer in the U.S. Military who was in an explosion. His face totally disfigured, but they don't put any metal in it or whatever. But his chest is severely damaged, so he gets these metal plates, which make him almost impervious to bullets. And there was a show that began in 1965 called The Wild Wild West. And in January 1966, they aired an episode called The Night of the Steel Assassin. And the Steel Assassin is a character named Torres. And there were two writers involved. Fisher wrote an outline, and then they gave it to another writer named Calvin Clements to expand it. And Torres was sort of Sheridan Doom gone evil. He's an American officer who gets blown up. Through his own genius, he somehow gets he supervises an operation where his flesh gets merged with metal. And he's this somewhat half robotic, half human villain. And I think that was probably where Ron Gula got most of the Iron Skull from. Now, the series got canceled, and we had some loose ends. First of all, the Iron Skull's still running around. Second, there was a novel called The Last Man, where the Avenger fought an invisible man, and there was a Nazi spy named Werner Conrad, who was sort of an evil master in disguise, sort of a German version of Lon Chaney Sr., who now works for Hitler as a spy. He's also still at large, never got brought to justice. And at the end of the last novel, Demon Island, what Goulart liked to do was insert a little opening for the next novel in each novel as it ended, sort of what they used to do in Doc Savage and The Shadow. And suddenly has the Avenger received word that his wife and child are alive. And it gradually leaked out that they were going to be robots created by the guy in the skull. But as you see, we'll eventually get one of these loose ends resolved. Two will still remain not resolved. Now, in the interim, when there are no new Avenger stories getting written, you get some parodies of the Avenger by Philip Jose Farmer. And one of these is in a series called Great Heart Silver, which began in 1975, and the story is called Great Heart Silver in Shootout, Showdown and Shootout, is the title. And in that story, there were parodies of every pulp hero from the 1930s, and they go to this town in the West, and they end up killing each other. They're mainly fighting here Dr. Kluger from G8. But you have a character who's supposed to be the Avenger, and he's called the Punisher. Now, in case you're wondering if that had any connection to the Marvel character, the Punisher had appeared 2 years. The story was published in 1935. 1973 is when the Punisher appeared in The Amazing Spider-Man, but he was just a supporting character that he didn't get his own magazine until years later. So Farmer was probably totally unaware that there was a Marvel character with that name. The other story that Philip Jose Farmer did that was a parody of the Avenger was a story called Savage Shadow, which is a story in which Kenneth Robeson is not Lester Dent. It's not Paul Lawrence, but it's Kenneth Robeson. The story pretends that there really was a writer named Kenneth Robeson who used his real name and wrote all these novels. And in Savage Shadow, which you can find in the Farmer collection, Pearls from Peoria, Robeson meets real-life people whose base is supposedly the Shadow of the Avenger on. So Doc Savage and Doc Savage is the Avenger. And Doc Savage is supposedly based on a drunken veterinarian. And the Avenger is based on some crazy mafia guy who's called the Vindictive One. So family gets wiped out by a rival gangster who's out to kill all the other mafia guys. Now, Lynn Carter in the 70s began a series called Prince Zarga, which was sort of a variation on Doc Savage. Doc Savage like hero. And he would have various pulp, even though the stories were set in the 70s, Carter would have pulp heroes from the 30s take cameos. And his favorite little device was to have Prince Zargan go to the Cobalt Club in the shadow. And all these members there who were Richard Wentworth, Lamont Cranston. You get Bruce Wayne as Batman. Well, Bruce Wayne as Batman. Bruce Wayne. And in one of them, the volcano over, you have Richard Henry Benson in the Cobalt Club. But what's interesting about Benson is his face is now back to being paralyzed. And this led to some speculation in fandom that the Avenger somehow went into a relapse and went back to the way it originally had been. There's another Prince Zargan novel called The Earthshaker, in which all the heroines are a series of hanging out together. So Nellie Grace hanging out with Martha Lane and Doc Savage. Now, the best reference book on the Avenger is called Grey Nemesis. It was written by the late, great Howard Hopkins, who unfortunately passed away a few years back. And that, if you want to read a reference book on the Avenger, this is the book. It originally popped up in a fanzine, the earliest version of the fanzine that Howard was self-publishing called Golden Parents, 1985. And he revised it twice. I think the last revision was 2000. And this became the basis for a new Avenger series done by Moonstone Books. So we have the Avenger Chronicles and the Justice Incorporated files for the first two books, showing the hardcover version. And this is when I start to get involved. I used to write articles in imitation of Political Reformer for Pulp. And I was doing chronologies for various characters, Doc Savage, Shadow, Love. And I had done one for it was Echoes, then published by Tom Johnson, called Chronology, which ended up being reprinted in Daring Adventures by Opus Press, Washington. And I read the Avenger Chronicle, which was edited then by Joe McTilley and Howard Hopkins. And I immediately noticed that as far as Howard was concerned, he wasn't worried about consistency. He was treating this like a Sherlock Holmes. You have to be consistent with Ernst. He really wasn't worried about Blue Lord and temperament, except for the period. He would totally throw out the temperament stories. He treats the temperament stories the way Shadow fans treat the Bruce Elliott stories. They had there the concept that the Avenger suffers a relapse and has his facial muscles paralyzed again. But they would publish one story where they actually had that accident in November 1941. Then they had a sequel to by Ron Goulart called Return of the Iron Skull to Demon Island, in which the Iron Skull comes back. You can see these robots that are supposed to be posing as Benson's wife and child. Dissolving that loose end, but the Iron Skull still gets away, so it's still on the loose end. And that story is taking place like 1945. So I looked at it and I said, there's no way you can make chronological sense about this. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to leave my original article to stand. Never again involve myself in the event. I get an email out of the blue from Lynn Scott Eckert, who's one of the authors in these anthologies, saying Joe Gentili wants a chronology of the event. Would you like to do it? But by the way, now normally when I get chronologies, I'm a law unto myself, and I do whatever I want to do. Here are the restrictions Joe was placing on it. First of all, you can only have him, you have to have 3 periods, one where his space is frozen the first time, one where it's not frozen, and one where it gets frozen again. You can't have him going through relapses back and forth. And the other one was, all the Templeman stories have to kind of take place together. Because Howard Hopkins hates them. No. And he wants it so you can say that they're not only limited, you can ignore them, he doesn't want them into mix. So he said, okay, I'll do this. But you know, you've got this problem that you got Goulart from 1942 to 1945 has the Avenger without a frozen face, and suddenly you have this story which takes place in November 1941 where the accident happens which causes the relapse. So I had to come up with an explanation that it was a delayed reaction to this explosion. I'm not going to bore you with all the little gyrations that do it. I did cheat a little bit. His face does slip back and forth with the entries. But that's how I became a chronologist for the Avenger, officially licensed by Condé Nast. Personally, I wanted to wash my hands of the whole thing, to be honest. But I had to override sometimes a lot of references and stories to know they took place in there. But the other thing that Moonstone did, they had a story that Michael Uslang, which was, if you don't know who Michael Uslang is, he's a producer of Batman films. And as we so see gradually in comics, he has a long association with him, which is continuing to this day. And he did in the hardcover edition, a special feature, a story called the Queen Hornet event. Now, I didn't mention this earlier. Moonstone books in their hardcovers always has extra goodies. So if you want my chronology, you have to get the hardcover of the 3rd volume of the event, and you will go on part of the Crucible. Get the paperback, you're not going to get the chronology. And in this story, it's a pretty decent story where the Avenger is, it's a Green Hornet, you know the Green Hornet is supposed to be a crook, when he's actually a crime fighter. And the Avenger is sort of brought into Detroit to capture, to track down the Green Hornet, and gradually realizes the Green Hornet is a crime fighter. Now we come to the most interesting little innovation in the century. If you're a fan of new Pulp Fiction, you wouldn't be aware of the existence of a character named Sun Ko, who was actually a Nazi version of Doc Savage, created by in Hitler's Germany. Was very popular in the 30s. Was not known to any of us except the fellow who Jess Nevins wrote about the Sunco series on a website called Fourth Heroes. And a fellow who I'm looking at right now named Art Seppo decided to write a collection of Sunco stories, not based on this, they're totally new, they're not consistent with the original German. So, Sunco became a novel by Art, a book by Art, and at this point, every new Pulp writer has used Sunco as a villain in their writings, and he's scheduled to fight the Avenger in Moonstone in a novel published by Moonstone, written by Matthew Paul. Now, I'm briefly just going to mention the radio and comic book versions of the Avenger. First, there was a 1942 series about the Avenger where it was Richard Benson, which is largely an adaptation of the Pulp novels. In 1945-46, there was a different Avenger series where there was a character named James Brandon, who was essentially a rip-off of the Shadow, that he could make himself invisible, but he did it by swallowing capsules. In DC Comics in 1975, the short-lived Justice Incorporated series, Jack Kirby did issues 2 through 4. And they were doing the Shadow at the same time, and Michael Uslan wrote a story where he fought the Shadow. And then they did some, DC did some controversial concepts, some controversial adaptations. One was called Justice Incorporated, and the two-shot, in which the Avengerism, I think, killing Billy Ray. And then we had the controversial First Wave series, in which the Avenger became a killer, like he was an Abel Tepperman, more like the normal superhero of Punisher. But the big news is Michael Uslan is doing a comic book called Justice Incorporated, in which the Shadow, Doc Savage, the Avenger, will meet for the first time in the comics. And it's going to be coming out this month, and in summaries I've read, it seems to be a revised origin of the Avenger, in which Doc Savage and the Shadow play a direct role in his creation. And that is the conclusion to the history of the